As we emerge from COVID-19 and start to attempt to restart our economy, there's a big question that's on most people's lips. Will our biggest employers, industries and economies try to bounce forward into a new way of operating, or will they simply try to bounce back and restore the ways that they've always worked before? We can draw some direct parallels here with some of the experience and issues that we're finding with ecological resilience across some of our biggest farming and food production industries. Our current model of farming and food production has meant that over the last few years, the yields that we rely on are becoming harder and harder to maintain. It requires more cost, it creates more waste, and each year is a cycle of deeper degradation in order to stay the same. And sudden unpredictable events, the ecological equivalent of COVID-19, climate change, flooding, drought. These kinds of events turn very quickly from being traumas to being unsurvivable. I think it's entirely possible to draw a parallel between the industrial depletive agricultural cycle and the industrialization of change and change management in our largest organizations. And I'm just going to quickly walk you through that. So let's start with the agricultural cycle, the cycle of depletion that's much challenged by the permaculture and ecological thinking processes. So we start at present with the choice to assume a monoculture of an annual crop, something like corn or wheat. The focus when we do plant our fields this way is on one beneficial yield only, which is the profit cash crop of choice, so corn if that's the example. Having made that choice, we then go on to buy highly modified, normally, seed from a supplier who's developed a patented and owned seed alongside a set of other products that form a system of interventions for yielding this one crop at the exclusion of everything else. Whether the seed is genetically modified or modified through traditional means is rather irrelevant in this case. Then the farmer goes on to plough the field, and mechanised ploughing in today's world is very deep and very harsh. This destroys the mycelium connections in the fungal infrastructures of the soil and all of the biological and interactive elements that make up the ecosystem of the soil. It reveals bare earth to the sky, which causes increased evaporation, heating of the soil and destruction of the infrastructure. Wind and water makes it easier. It makes it easier for wind and water to wash away soil particulates. And with this high level of disturbance, it enables the farmer to sow the annual seed crop. The monoculture will immediately start to deplete the soil of some of the nutrients that are particular nutrients that one crop wants, but other nutrients and other beneficial energies, if you like, in the soil are left untapped because that particular crop doesn't use them, and the crop adds nothing back in return. Because it's a monoculture, it will attract also a monoculture of pests that specifically feed on that crop and do well in that one cropping environment. This means that the farmer now has to make another intervention. The farmer has to buy the matching pesticides that go with his seed that will kill off the particular monoculture of pests that have now settled on his crop, and buy the matching fertilizers that have been created specifically to add the nutrient elements that this crop needs in rather large quantities, which would then cause the crop to go into a growth spurt with lots of tender young growth, which actually, the minute the pesticide has worn off, will attract a new quantity of the same pests. Doing this repeatedly forces the land to remain juvenile, by which we mean it's restarted from scratch every year. There's no succession, there's no ability for the land to mature with a balancing ecosystem of predators for the pests, or for the ground cover to develop and protect the soil. There's no mycelium connections that really feed the soil or move nutrients around. There's no capacity for self-restoration, and so the soil and the whole ecosystem that surrounds it becomes depleted and fragile over time. At the end of the season, the whole field is ploughed over again at the end of that cycle, and all debris is removed and probably burnt or disposed of in some other way. Nothing really is returned to the land, and we start all over again, buying our modified seed to produce our next year's crop. Ongoing cycles like this degenerate the capacity of the system overall, and to the benefit of the manufacturers, it ensures future dependency on the seed supply with all of its matching components. Now we can draw this parallel straight into the change management industry that's developed over the last 20-30 years with huge profits in certain sectors. Firstly, a lot of what is written about or proposed in many of the business schools and consultancies of the world is to try to focus on creating something that you're really brilliant at and create a monoculture with real focus and attention. This produces a single yield, which even if you have multiple products, the only yield that's really being paid attention to is profit, money, shareholder return. This causes the organisation to buy in highly modified change interventions from a limited group of consultancies or offerings, which have developed their own equivalent of a patent product, which sets within and nests within a set of products that form a system of interventions, all with the same fundamental assumption of maximising monetary profit. Often the organisation is encouraged to restructure. This is the equivalent of ploughing the soil. It destroys the interconnected mycelium equivalent of team and relational ecostructures, the communication web that moves knowledge, skills and awareness around the organisation. And this immediately increases self-centric protectionism, and into this disturbance the organisation will be encouraged to clarify its objectives and set new targets that increase the profitable growth in fragmented silos, where different activities and metrics separated from each other will allow leaders to manage these silos differently, a bit like the separate fields with different crops in them. As these management and new objectives start to bite, then a focus develops only on the things that get valued and measured in accordance with that one yield, shareholder return, and this will increasingly attract a monoculture of people who are only interested in serving that need. They tend to self-serve at the cost of others, and motivation and spontaneous innovation starts to fall because the focus is very linear and singular. As this falls, leaders start to worry about the health of the organisation, so they go back to the original consultancies and schools and buy the matching products that go with the original change intervention. This might be ERP and reporting systems and metrics that help them repress any activity that grows like weeds that is not aligned with the single crop that's been designed in the strategy. And at the same time, they may buy matching motivational products, which are a bit like fertilizers, rewarding and boosting packages that focus people and stimulate them to overwork, a bit like the boost of growth that you get after you fertilize a field. All this forces the culture, like the soil and ecosystem in a field, to remain juvenile. It resets every year with a new annual round of budgeting, a new annual round of accounting, a new annual round of performance appraisals and rewards and metrics. There's no growing up, there's no succession in a sense, no balancing relationships or ecosystems can develop that might challenge some of the power and bring a more ethical conversation, a more challenging conversation to the groupthink that might fall into place. Accountability starts to fall and local adaptation to customers or circumstances reduce because the system demands compliance and dependency increases. Ethics and sustainability are depleted and become fragile over time. And as the results start to fall apart, which they inevitably do, and start to weaken, the organisation reaches out and finds a new, often identical consultancy or school, and starts a new, often identical initiative, and launches a new, often identical restructuring. And all of this brings us back to the start. And we can see how these ongoing cycles degenerate the capacity of the system to evolve, to adapt, to innovate, and to become an anti-fragile organisation. It therefore ensures future dependency on those external interventions and expenditures, feeding the pockets of the large consultancies and schools that provide these interventions. I try not to sound too cynical when I describe these cycles, but having been in large organisations and having consulted to them for over 30 years from a completely different perspective, I can say that this has definitely been my experience of what is considered normal practice. And I hope that by educating a new round of young leaders to be aware of these depletive cycles, we can start to interrupt them and create a more anti-fragile and flourishing system of organisation and change. These processes claim to give us robustness and predictability and certainty, but actually they make us fragile. We just don't know what it is that's going to crack us before it arrives. We believe that what organisations need to do now is to learn from COVID-19, to learn from climate change and degradation, and look to new models which will help us build anti-fragility, which is by no means the same as having things that are strong and stable. Anti-fragility comes from the capacity to be improved by engaging with the shock, by having the capacity to learn and be adaptive and to move through processes of constant change in order to have persistence over time. We can make a direct link to ecological resilience, and believe me, I'm not being overly romantic here. I'm not proposing that we should all go back to some kind of medieval existence. What I'm talking about here is drawing directly the learning, the modern scientific learning for how natural ecosystems manage in a way that is constantly changing but constantly persistent. For example, we know that nature over-insures itself, whereas in our organisations we often strive for single-line efficiency. In organisations, we often try to keep things the same, to pin them down. But persistence in nature comes from constant change, not from stability. And in any kind of species persistence, alignment is actually a precursor to death. Maturity actually arises from connection and from fostering an ongoing social process which enables the succession of thinking and the development of learning capacity. So if in your organisation you're facing somewhat of a restart or a reboot following the COVID-19, I'd like to ask you a few questions. Are you interested as you move forward in increasing not only the quantity of your yield, but the range and the breadth of it, thinking of it in a whole new way? Would you like to achieve that for less work, less cost, and producing less waste, perhaps finding ways to turn what you're currently wasting that you might not even know you're wasting into new sources of energy, intrinsic energy and motivation, and new products and new ways of working forward. Would you like to free yourself from the endless routines of costly intervention and start to create an organisation that is actually enabled to evolve through iteration and adaptation? And this will provide you with ongoing anti-fragility. If this is of interest to you, then we have the learning processes that can help you to develop those leadership skills and that cultural understanding that can change the way you work moving out of COVID-19. We work with some of the largest organisations in the world, as well as young startups and social enterprises, and some of the most innovative business schools, developing the leaders of the future and helping organisations to change and create themselves in the image of anti-fragile natural systems. If you're interested in talking to us, just reach out. We'd be glad to share some of our learning with you. And we wish you the very best as you bring your company and your community out of lockdown and into the new world of post-COVID-19 economy. Bye for now.